Oh, this is Doreen Margaret Webb, and I'm an American citizen, but I was born in London, England, and I was born in 1927, July the 19th, 1927. I had only one brother, and I was 9 years older than he was. But first, I'll tell you about my family a little bit. I came from one of my grandfathers was Irish, and my dad's father was from Germany, so it's sort of a mixture. I have a real interest in strange, very, what can I say, unusual family, and I've got lots of different things and very colorful people. Anyway, it was a bright morning when I was born, and it was in the middle of in London at 165 Kennington Road, and it was a bright sunny day. And I was born, I believe, in the morning at around about 9:30. And my dad had already left for work. He had to go to work. And he was working as a doorman at Thistle Tea Rooms at that time. And we lived in this house with my grandmother. It was my grandmother. I thought it was her grandmother's house. I thought she owned it, but really, her father, her husband got it for 99 years lease on it. And so it was built in the late 1700s, so it was a really old house. One of a row house. I was born in the back, one of the back bedrooms at Kennington Road, and the midwife and the nurse from Australia, nurses from Australia, always attended my mother, and I was born loving, caring family. My mother was 18 years old, my father was 21 years old. My dad, like I said, my dad had already left for work, and it was the Depression time, and he was lucky to be even working as a doorman. And the Thistle Tea Rooms is at the top of the Haymarket in London, Piccadilly, and it's on the roads leading from Piccadilly Circus. And one of the people my grandmother rented rooms to was Mr. and Mrs. William Fortnum, and they were my godparents. Anyway, he went to work that morning, and he was later than my dad, and he had some type of signal that he would tell. When my dad was standing outside the Thistle Tea Rooms, he would wave a handkerchief, a white handkerchief or something, and he would see that I'd been born like a girl. And I believe that's what happened. He went to work, and he made a sign with the handkerchief and was able to communicate with my dad that he had a daughter. And I was received with great joy and love. I had two my grandmothers alive, and they both wanted a granddaughter. My maternal grandmother had 3 grandchildren living in the U.S., whom she had never seen. Also a granddaughter that was taken from her after her daughter Violet died. I'll tell you more about that later. My paternal grandmother had 5 sons and 1 daughter, Dorothy Margaret, who had died on her 11th birthday in November the 11th, in 1912. I was going to be named for her. My mother must have voiced her displeasure with the name Dorothy because this Australian nurse suggested that maybe the name Doreen was better, maybe she would like that. My mother chose that name to be Doreen Margaret. My mother told me she didn't like Dorothy because most people were called Dolly as a nickname. In later life, I have come to believe, knowing my mother, that she didn't like the idea of naming me for a dead child. And I'm sure my grandmother must have been disappointed. I'll tell you a little bit about my grandmother that we lived in Kennington Road with. That's my mother's mother. Her name was Agnes Durham. Her first name was Agnes Durham. When she got married, it became Malthouse. And she was married to Frederick James Malthouse. She was a twin when she was born, and she always suffered with a bad heart all her life. She died when she was about 60 years old. And so she had this twin. It was a girl named Blanche. But this girl, Blanche, I believe, died as a young child, about 2 or 3 years old. And she had a lot of French names. That named their children a lot of French. Not my grandmother, but her mother. And she married. She wasn't a Catholic, but my grandfather was. He had come. Don't believe he came from Ireland himself, but his father did. He was Irish, and he'd come over to England, and he had got. He was a strict Catholic, and my grandmother converted to Catholicism, but she became really into it too. So the kids, the children, like my mother and all that, they were brought up very strict. My grandfather ruled the roost, and he took care of all the bills, did all the money, and took them out once or twice a year, I think, and bought them all their clothes, and for the winter season and the summer season. He would always like to buy coats that you could turn, jackets and coats that you could turn up so you could wear them another year. And he was very strict, and they were, he'd sit down with a little cane at the end of the table. Of course, there was few people in their family. There was, I'm trying to think, Nellie and Violet and my mother and Bill and Len and Fred. And I can't think of any more right now. But anyway, they were very strictly brought up, and you used to sit with a little cane. And on Sundays, they weren't allowed to play outside, or weren't allowed to play. They had to go to church 3 times a day, and nothing, so read the Bible or something. Nothing, even there was just nothing they could do on Sundays anyway. I don't think they played too much about it anyway, because they were, like I said, they were very strict. And my grandfather, I didn't know my grandfather. I didn't know my grandfather Malthouse. He had died in about 1920, around about that time. And I wouldn't like to know him. He might have been nicer with me. I was the first girl, I would have been like the first grandchild they would have seen, because I was from my grandmother. Well, no, there was this, my Aunt Violet, my mother's sister Violet, she, well, let me tell you, when my grandfather died, Violet told my grandmother that she had been married and she was having this baby. She had run off and got married because my grandfather's been strict, and she was having this baby. And when she had it, she was married to a man named Ernie Young, and he was something of a racing car driver. He must have met my grandfather through the shop that my grandfather knew. My grandfather was a maker of bicycles, and then he built the brass lamps for what cars used to have, the lamp headlights. But anyway, she married Ernie Young, and he was a race car driver at Brookfield I think Brook something, or and Silverstone, a meeting racing racetracks. They round about in the early 1900s, they was very keen on racetracks in London and car racing, because cars were just really beginning to come on the scene. So she married him, but I think it was about a couple of years afterwards, she died. Not too long after the baby was born, and she had, I believe, what was called my Aunt Nell told me she had an infection, had gotten an infection and died. And my Ernie Young, he I don't know, he went strange. He took all her clothes and things down, because they was in the house in the Kennington Road, and he burnt everything up of the baby, of all, not the babies, but I mean, all the things he burnt up. And he took the daughter, Joan, she was named Joan Young. She was taken away, and my grandmother never ever saw her again, or him. And he just took her baby away, and that was the end of Violet's baby. Then that was that one, and then Nellie she told, after my granddad died, she told her that, she got mixed up with this American sailor from the war, and he wasn't a very nice person, and she wanted to get married to him, and she was very young, I think about 18 years old, and she was married in Southwark Cathedral, which is a famous cathedral in London, and I know my mother told me that the person who married her, he told my grandmother he wasn't the right one for her or something, but they were married. She went off to America, and she had two boys, Carlo and Golden, and then she had a girl, Peggy, and then Jacqueline. So they were my grandmother's other grandchildren, but she had never seen them. So when I came along, I was really made a fuss of. And also, my dad's family, they had lost, there was like old boys, and except for Dorothy and Margaret, who died years before that, 1911. I was, like the little girl coming into the family, so they were real happy to have a girl. So I was made a fuss of. I really felt like I was special. I had lots of love. And the Eberhard family, my dad's family, they, my grandfather's name was George Conrad Eberhard. That's Eberhard. They're called Eberhard, but Eberhard in German. In Germany, you pronounce it Eberhard. Anyway, he came to England when he was a young man, and he came and worked in the restaurant business. And at that time, in the Victorian times, it was very fashionable to have Germans whose work. They had the best jobs in the restaurants. Then, like the Greeks and the other ones, Cypriots, they were the ones in the kitchen porters and things. But the ones that came out, the waiters, they were Germans. Everything was German was wonderful in England at that time. Queen Victoria was married to the old prince, so from Germany. So that was fine. They had quite a few children themselves. They had Fred, he was the oldest one. He was born in about 1900 somewhere. I think it's 1900. And Dorothy Margaret, the one that died. And they had Rodel. He died when he was about 20 years old. And Ernest, he was my dad. That was my dad. Max and Leslie, Maximilian Leonard and Leslie Gordon. Then there's Armand Henry. He wondered where he got all these fancy names from, like Maximilian and Leslie Gordon. And I heard not too many years ago that they got it. My dad told me that he got it because it was my grandfather's friends who he worked with. So he named him after his friends. But my dad's name, Ernest, I always call him Ernie and Ernest and Ernie. But as he goes. When my mother met my dad, he was working, they was both working at the Lions Corner House. My mother was 15, he was 18, and she happened to see him standing across the way somewhere. She asked somebody, she said, who's that person? Who's that, fellow over there? What's his name? And she said, oh, that's Peter. So I don't know, I might have been looking at another person because she met my dad. She got to know him. She told me he kissed her in the lift, the elevator. And so anyway, when they started seeing each other, and they went out to, when they went up to my grandmother's place. At that time, my grandfather died, and a lot of things had been going on, and they've had a bad life. But they were back in England after being in Germany for a while. And when my mother went up to Briscoe Buildings in Brixton Hill, he met my grandmother, and I kept on. My grandmother, he said he's talking about when her Ernie's this and Ernie's that, and my mother thought they had another brother named Ernie, but then she found out, but she never could get used to calling him Ernie or Ernest, so he was always Peter to her, Pete. And he became Peter to everybody, it seemed like that. Even his mother used to call him Peter sometimes, Well, he just become, his brothers all call him Pete. Once in a while they call him Ernie for, like a joke or something. But he was always Peter. My mother loved the name of Peter. And then when she had my brother, she named him Peter Ernest. And Ronald, after one of her cousins that kept on after her to call him Ronald. She wanted to name him Ronald because she had had a son. He was just a young man. And this lady, well, they call her Maggie, but she got, in the end, she wanted to be called Margaret, her proper name, so we all called her Margaret. And when she had married a dentist, and he went up to the north of England, like Newcastle, and they had children, 3 children, or maybe 4 children. One of them, Ronald, was he used to have problems. He used to have, I guess it was seizures. They called them fits, seizures. And they used to sort of tie him down in bed at night. He would fly around. Well, they had a candle, they used to have night lights and candles in those days. They didn't have any electricity. And they had this candle on, and the house caught fire, and he was burnt to death. So my mother did name Peter Ernest Ronald because he was so anxious, would like that. Oh, that's how he got his name. Anyway, when I was born, most of my uncles were sort of young in their teens, so I never really, I never thought of them as calling them Uncle this and Uncle that, They were my uncles, but I always called them by their first names, Fred and Max and Les and Armand. My mother's brothers, they were young too, so I always called them Len and Bill. They had Len and Bill, and they were the ones that lived in the house. They weren't married. Most of them weren't married when I was born. When my grandfather came to England and worked in a restaurant, he worked, I've forgotten the name of Jim's got it down somewhere in our history of Eberhard. But it was a place in Dover, on England, on the coast, southeast coast. And my grandmother worked at this hotel as a chambermaid. And my grandfather, George Conrad Eberhard, he met her there and fell in love with her. And they had all those children. But when the war came, everything was going fine for Germans. Everything was, Kaiser Willie was coming over to England, and of course his grandmother was, I think his grandmother, Queen Victoria, and to see her and having a good time, and everything was wonderful to be German. For then, when he was as a young child, he was, I don't know, brainwashed or something. I don't know how that war started exactly, but the 1914-18 war started, and they came in the night. My grandfather, he was just a young man, and he came to England as a young man and spoke English. He spoke several languages, and they came in the night, and they took him away, and they took him to a prisoner of war camp for all, like, foreign nationals, because he was German. And my grandmother was just left with all these children to take care of. Dorothy had died, and so Rodel sort of took over to do things. And my dad always said he was a great help with the family. So I don't know how they managed for money. They tried to get little odd jobs. They were they were coming up in their teens. They weren't very old. And Jim has got another diary that my grandfather wrote when he was in a prisoner of war camp. And he was very artistic and could do a lot of things with his hands. And I know my dad said he made his own violin, and I don't know what happened to all these things. And he made a violin and taught himself to play. He wouldn't do carvings, and I think he also made a zither, and that's a musical instrument with like strings on it. My dad said he used to play that, and he was like to breed German dogs, dachshunds, and he had those to breed, and he used to sell them. In fact, the Lord Montgomery's father, he was one of the preachers in the church close to where my dad lived with his family. My dad lived at Camberwell at the time, and Lord Montgomery's father was in the church at St. Mark's, Kennington, and then he sold him a couple of dachshunds to him. When my grandfather was in prison, the family was able to go and see him a few times, but he was sent to the Isle of Man. Of course, they couldn't see him there. I guess they managed with a few letters. Of course, some of that was restricted. At that particular time, during the end part of the war, 1918, Frederick Rudolph, his son, was in the British Army. It's strange to think that he had to go in the British Army and fighting against the Germans. His father was German. Anyway, there came a time, I don't think Fred went to Germany, but I'm not quite sure on that deal. But the family, my grandfather couldn't stay in England. No, they didn't want him in England. They were very bitter towards the Germans. And if you had a German name, or anybody worked in stores and bakers, or any named Eberhard or a German name, they would break windows and were really, really bad to you, and really hateful. So he went back to Germany, to his home in Sterndorf near Nuremberg, and his brother, I think, had a soap factory, and he went back there to be a manager, was there. And my grandmother followed, and I think my dad said it took them 3 weeks to get there, but train, it was like an old cattle train, kept stopping and everything. They'd have to, he said they'd get out of the train, off the train, and when it was stopped, dig in the fields and try to get some food over there. I don't know how they managed, because she was with all these children, her family. I know it was a terrible time, and they finally got to a destination, and they stayed there. And of course, they all spoke English. Nobody understood any German, so they had to. They put the children had to go to school, and all the German kids would laugh at them and make fun and tell them to go home, and geh heim, and zurück, and go back, and go home. And they just didn't like being there. But what was sort of strange, some of them had to go to kindergarten. It's just they would be kids, and they had to go to kindergarten. They didn't like that at all. That really made them feel bad. And my dad, I don't know how he managed to get out of it, but he was going to be an apprentice to a bakery, and going to be a patissier, making pastries and bread. And I think he said they went to look at this place, and they fixed a little bed up under the stairs for him or something. But I don't know what happened, but he didn't last long, and he didn't go there. And I think at that particular time my grandfather was getting sick and ill, and so he seemed like a very sweet person, my grandfather, my German grandfather, at least. What I heard about my Irish grandfather, he didn't sound so sweet to me, but he sounds typical Irish. Anyway, my grandfather did die there. He died, I think he was 52 years old, and he had some type of lung cancer. And my grandmother had a hard time, and no money, she couldn't speak German. So they managed to come back to, England. That was the only thing she could think of, get back with her family, and everybody, they didn't like it in Germany. People being so mean and couldn't speak the language. And there was nothing then, but Germany was so terrible, devastated, and I've forgotten how many thousands or millions of marks my dad said. My grandmother did buy him a suit. It was like a suit of clothes. It was like paper, and he said that she had to pay so much, terrible amount of money for it. Anyway, they did get, they showed people taking, I think, wheelbarrow loads of money, because money didn't mean anything, wasn't worth anything. Anyway, they came back, and my grandmother, I think she got a job cleaning offices over at Millbank across the river. So that's what they had to do. Women, they weren't too many jobs for women to do, and they were very menial and didn't make any money, but I don't know how on earth they lived, but she managed to keep them all together. Like Fred, like he was in the army, he was like 18. And then there was, at that particular time, I think, Dorothy Margaret had died. Rodler, my dad said he used to go out, he seemed to be like the man of the family, and he'd go out and work and have several jobs, and he just helping the family. He worked so hard, my dad said he thinks he killed himself, and he had a bad heart. Dorothy Margaret was supposed to have a bad heart because of rheumatic fever. And Rodel, I think, was the same way. Anyway, he died at a young age. And then there was my dad. That was the next brother down, and Ernest. And then Max. Max, I think they had I think they got married just after I was born or something. Anyway, there was Maximilian, and then Leslie. I remember going to Leslie's wedding. I was I don't know, I was about 8 years old, I guess, yeah. Or maybe a little older. I can't remember quite. But then there was Armand. He never did marry. He was sort of a misfit person. Fred, he would love to read books. Armand did too. Fred always had a book under his arm, and they were very well. They weren't educated, but you know, they weren't educated formally, but they educated themselves by reading books. And my dad never read that much because he was always, seemed like he was always working. But Max liked to read books, and he always seemed like interested in being a doctor, but because he wasn't. But he did go to like a training school, and he became an electrician, which was very good. Leslie, he went and got a job. He got a job as a doorman too, like my dad, but they worked in very good places and met with high society people, and they did very well in their life. Armand, I don't know how many jobs he had. He had so many jobs, and he never did quite find his niche in life. He never did marry. He went in the army in 1945, you know, or not 40, 1939, 45 war. Anyway, I'll tell you more about some of the bombings later on in some of his jobs. Going back to the malt houses, Violet Malt House. I think there was Violet Malt House. I think she was the older, and like I said, she died after she had a child. And then there was Helen Nellie, and she was the one that went off to America. My mother was like 10 years old, 8 or 10 years old. And Fred, then there was Frederick James. Frederick James, my grandfather wanted a boy so badly. My Uncle Fred was the third boy that they had. In each one they had 2 others before been named Frederick James, but died at birth, both of them. And then there was Len. His name was Leonard. I think his name was just Leonard. And then my mother, Kathleen, her name, she just had one name, called Kathleen. But all her life she was called, you know, Kathleen. Well, Kathleen, she always wrote the name Kathleen. And she was known as Kitty, mostly Kit. And she was a dear, sweet person. But she'd say to me, you know, I think my name's Catherine, you know, and I would sort of laugh and joke it off, you know, joke about it, you know, then, oh yeah, because you like the name Catherine, you think it's royal, you know, with the King Henry VIII, and that, you know, it's Catherine. And then there was the youngest brother was William Bill. He had a strange story in his life. Each one had different lives, you know, they're very colorful, some of them. Although, I don't know if they thought it was too great, but it's really, really varied. And both families had a terrific sense of humor, and it was always fun, even though we didn't have a lot, but we thought everything was great, and we thought we was doing well, even if it wasn't. But you could always joke and laugh, and it didn't cost any money to do that, and that's what the Motown Eberhards did. They're great, and I love them very much. I always thought it was sort of a coincidence that my mother's brother, Frederick James, and William had the same birthday, of course, different years, but they both shared it. February the 11th was their birthday. And it was strange. The strange part was Frederick Frederick Rudolph, my dad's brother, and Maximilian Leonard, they were at the same birthday too. They were born on May the 8th. May the 8th. Of course, they're again different years. But I thought that was so strange. But they were a great family, and I just thought they were just terrific. And I'm sorry, most of them have died now. My Aunt Nell went to America. Well, going back, thinking about my grandfather in Germany, if he hadn't have died, I would never have been born, and none of my beautiful family would have been here, all my sons and my daughters, because they wouldn't have been born. So, it's strange, but somebody dying, it gives, it makes room for you. It's strange. It never would have existed. So it seems like everything's done for a reason. Seems like it's all worked out. Patchwork, I mean. We're all sort of joined together. I feel like my voice sounds sort of raspy, getting rough. I have a problem, starting to get a problem with my lungs a bit, and my breathing. So I thought, well, I better get this recorded before I get too sick or anything. I wouldn't be able to feel good. I'm pretty bad at procrastinating, I do that. I wish I could be like Jim, my husband. He's so wonderful that you just tell him something, he does it straight away and he takes care of it. And I can sort of wait it out a bit. I think I'm like my dad. He's like that. He was very laid back, as they would say nowadays. And he never seems like he thinks to worry about things. That's the best way, So you live longer. My dad did live a long time. He died recently, last December the 21st, 1999. It seems like most families in those days, they had sort of hard life. They seemed like they had a lot of children, which wasn't unusual for those families to have 7 or 8 kids. Even though my grandmother had a bad heart, she still had a lot of, she had Violet and Helen and Fred and Catherine and William, and the 2 children that she lost, the 2 Frederick James, that died. But she had a lot, and it was a hard life for her, because my mother's father died when he was, I think he was 44 years old. He was the one that father had come from England, Ireland, and he leased the house. I think my mother was about 2 or 3 years old when she went to Kennington Road. And she was born in Hotspur Street. Hotspur was some famous knight. That's Knight, in olden days, and it's named after that. But they all lived there, but they had problems, with him dying. He did very well for himself. He had 2 businesses. First, he had a bicycle shop that they made bicycles. Bicycles were so big a thing in those days. My grandmother and him, they went to Monte Carlo on a bicycle. Bicycles. I don't know if it was a tandem. It might have been a tandem, but they went there together for their honeymoon. And of course, they went across the channel, and then they rode. I think they was gone for several weeks. And they went on a bicycle to Monte Carlo. And so he used to make bicycles. And then he had a lamp. Then when the cars started getting popular, he started making brass headlamps. It's all done by hand. And in fact, one of my cousins in America, Carlo, he said he went to a car show and he saw one of my dad's, it was our grandfather, lamps that he had made. He had his name, F. Malthouse, on it. I would love to see a lamp that he had made, brush lamp. Maybe some of these old antique cars, maybe you would see his name on one of the lamps. Anyway, he had that. He always said, anyway, he had about, I think he had about 18 men working for him when he died. But like I said, in those days, men ruled the roost and didn't let their wives know too much. I mean, the wives were just at home and taking care of children, having children, and just working in the home. And so they didn't include them into money matters for them to do. In fact, my granddad handled all the bills. My grandmother didn't know a thing, and then when their children was too young to really like young teenagers, and Fred and Bill, and of course the girls were not good, but Fred and Bill, they didn't learn. They were too young to handle a business, and so they had somebody, but I think sometimes he said, that she was robbed blind, and she didn't know what. And so all the money sort of all went. And at that time, too, Nell, I think, went a bit wild with the money when my grandmother got. And I think my mother said, from being all dressed in somber, dark clothes that didn't show the dirt, Nellie would take my mother out and get her all these fancy little dresses, all bright and expensive things, and spend the money that way. And I'm sure she spent money going to America when she went to America. And I do know that my grandmother did send Nellie money to pay the fare to come home, to come back to England, because she was very unhappy with her husband. So she ended up having 4 children with him, but she always told me that Sewell, his name was Sewell Kingsway, he got the money anyway. When the grandmother sent it to America, I don't know how, but he was an abusive man, and he hit her and everything. So he came from West Virginia, up in the hills somewhere, and I remember Peggy, that was what one of their daughters told me, that one time when Nellie went up to West Virginia to meet the family there, one of the mother's sons came in and asked them about breakfast and like for the food, the biscuits was ready. The biscuits weren't ready, so he gave her a big punch in the stomach. And that was the type of family I think Sewell had come from. And so I never did see him. I never did meet him. I never cared to. Anyway, and later life, now he married another man. He seemed okay, but he was alcoholic like her first husband. And he said, he took it because he was in a car accident and he had to be in a very nice looking he was. He was in a car accident and he was crippled. And he used to keep, that's why he said he used to hide all over the place. I think he eventually died too. But Nellie lived till, I think she was 95 when she died. That was my mother's sister in America. She was one of the one who lived the longest. And she told a few fibs. I think that was the Irish one. She always made out she came to America when she was 16. She was funny about her age. She never wanted to talk about her age. And my dad saw years ago when she came to England, he said something, don't talk about it. she never wanted to. But I knew, but what my mother always told her when she was, like, at what age she was, and sure enough, Jackie looked at her death certificate one time and found out she was 2 more years older than what she made out she was. I don't know why, because this day and age with the Social Security and the problem is you get the right wrong age. So you might, what's it matter as long as you get there. Anyway, she ended up in her home, and Jackie took care of her wonderfully, and took really good care of her in Florida, and eventually she had to go into her house, and because she got strange, she tried to say it was her house, and Jackie's husband was, it was like, no, there was no good, and all the, not sort of strange, and she didn't know people. I went to see her, and actually I was helping feed her, and I said to her, I'd come from London. She said, oh, I've got relatives in London, and she didn't know me. And so it's blessings for when they die. You're just living in another world, and it's just terrible on the families. Oh, but she lived a long life. Nellie's name, we call her now Nellie, but her name was really Helen. And William, we called this boy Bill, he was the youngest one. And Glenn, they worked in the catering business, they were in the restaurants, and they used to work at the best hotels and best restaurants. And they seemed like it was a little bit more money there than anywhere. There wasn't the opportunity